Well, it's now 5 weeks until the coronation. I do hope you're getting excited. I know I am. The videos on this channel are now going to come thick and fast as I work through the whole coronation ceremony stage by stage and explain its various elements and symbolism. As I do that, I'll be looking at the different items of regalia that I've not yet considered, linking them to their practical use in the ceremony. April's issue of my magazine The Antiquary is now available. Articles this month are on dubious princesses, caves, girdles and Dick Turpin the Highwayman. Thanks to all my readers and subscribers for your kind support. Purchasing The Antiquary magazine helps support this channel directly. Follow the link above if you would like to subscribe or purchase the latest copy or any back issues. Now, in my last video on the coronation, I talked about the gold state coach that the sovereign traditionally travels to and from Westminster Abbey in. When the king arrives at the abbey in 5 weeks' time for his coronation, perhaps in the gold state coach, perhaps not, he will be set down at the great west door of the abbey, and with the queen he will then make his way to the coronation theatre and the sacrarium, where they will both be anointed and crowned. They will make their way there in a long procession, that is if previous coronations are indicative, which will include well over 200 people. The tradition of the sovereign travelling to the abbey west door by coach and then a procession taking place only within the abbey church itself is relatively new in coronation history. It's an innovation that dates only from 1831 and the coronation of William IV. Prior to that, the sovereign and their consort, if there was a consort, processed on foot to their coronation from the medieval Palace of Westminster close by. In the early Middle Ages, they were often barefoot. The present procession in the abbey is just a shortened form of this walking procession, which I will discuss in some depth in a moment. But up until the coronation of Charles II in 1661, there were in fact 2 coronation processions, one of them taking place on the day before the coronation. It was the tradition from the early years of the 14th century until 1661 that the sovereign was prepared for their coronation at the Tower of London, which as well as a fortress was of course one of the main royal palaces and had fine and intimate royal apartments. The king would spend some time in the tower preparing himself spiritually for the solemn service in prayer and in vigil. Edward, Prince of Wales, Edward V, the son of Edward IV, with his brother Richard, were in the tower preparing for Edward's coronation when they disappeared without trace and their uncle Richard III usurped the throne. From the 14th century until the coronation of Charles II, during this time in the tower, new Knights of the Bath would be created. And on the morning before the coronation, the sovereign would then process on horseback, accompanied by those new Knights of the Bath, from the tower to the Palace of Westminster, the primary royal palace in London in the Middle Ages. This wonderful illustration shows the boy king Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII, processing from the tower down Cheapside to his coronation. He is on horseback under a canopy held by 4 riders, and the procession stretches ahead of him, and behind him is a detachment of guards. It shows him passing in front of the cross commemorating Queen Eleanor of Castile, the wife of Edward I. In the foreground can be seen the aldermen and citizens of the City of London watching his progress, and behind him are the goldsmiths' shops of Cheapside, who have put out all their finest wares, and from windows of the houses above people watch the scene below. People have decorated the fronts of the houses with tapestries and painted cloths, some decorated with the lives of the saints, the sort of thing Edward and his government would clear away in due course. The whole purpose of this procession through the streets of London was so that the king could be seen by his people, particularly by the people of London, whose support was politically important for all medieval and early modern sovereigns. The Lord Mayor of London himself was in the procession to make it clear that the Corporation of London were giving their seal of approval to the new king. During the procession, there were often pageants and the ceremony of challenge from the king's champion. We also have this little drawing of Queen Elizabeth I on her way from the Tower to Westminster, carried along in a litter borne by 2 horses. Then there's an illustration by Wenceslas Holler that shows the last procession of this sort for Charles II and is much more detailed. It is a well-armed procession. It is headed up by the sergeants at arms holding maces, a symbol of royal authority but once a real weapon. We also see among the company 2 figures labelled the persons representing the Dukes of Normandy and Aquitaine. These 2 individuals, who are present from the coronation of Richard III onwards in this procession, were gentlemen chosen by the king himself to act these roles. Of course, until 1800, the British sovereign still claimed the throne of France, and presumably these individuals represent that claim. Then following them, we see Garter King of Arms, the Gentleman Usher of the Black Rod, flanking on either side the Lord Mayor of London. 3 of the great officers of state, the Lord Great Chamberlain, the Lord High Constable of England and the Earl Marshal, ride in front of a large contingent of royal servants, pages and footmen. The king is shown on horseback. He is flanked by a large detachment of gentlemen pensioners and the yeomen of the guard, the king's personal bodyguards. The gentlemen pensioners are now called His Majesty's Bodyguard of the Honourable Corps of Gentlemen at Arms. When first established in 1509 by Henry VIII, they were established as his personal bodyguard, and they were drawn from the social elite. They were the sons of the nobles and the higher gentry. The yeomen of the guard were founded by Henry VII for a similar function. The master of the horse and the captains of the guard take up the rear. The procession from the Tower of London to the Palace of Westminster was a secular procession, but that on the morning of the coronation itself was a religious procession. On the morning of the coronation, the sovereign would rise and he would bathe, and then he would be dressed in his state robes. He would proceed to Westminster Hall, the great hall of the palace, where he was acclaimed by the nobles and then was lifted by them into a seat called the Marble Chair on the King's Bench in the upper end of the hall. Before the seat was the King's high table, on which lay the sword of state, a symbol of the sovereign's authority. The coronation procession began with the clergy of Westminster Abbey, in medieval times the abbot and convent, and after the dissolution of the monasteries the dean and chapter, bringing to Westminster Hall the crown of St Edward and the coronation regalia. Before it was destroyed in the Commonwealth, the medieval regalia was kept in the Abbey's treasury. This presentation of the regalia was an indication of the Church's willingness to allow these sacred objects to be released for the hallowing of the new sovereign. This illustration shows just that event when it last took place at the coronation of George IV. King George is sat behind the King's high table in Westminster Hall in his state robes and is being presented by the Dean and Chapter with St Edward's crown and the items of regalia one by one. The regalia was laid on the table and the sovereign then distributed it to the peers, the lords appointed by him to carry them in the procession that followed. The regalia peers were always chosen by the sovereign himself. Then the sovereign walked to the abbey with the regalia carried before him and in a large procession of many hundreds of people. The procession was headed by the drums and the court trumpeters. As this was a religious procession, the choirs and clerics of both the abbey and of the chapel royal led the way behind the trumpeters. In the Middle Ages, the choirs sung as they processed the plain song processional hymn Salve Festa Dies, Hail the Festival Day. From the reign of James II to that of George IV, the choir sang O Lord, grant the King a long life as the procession wended its way to the abbey. Following the choir and clergy were the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber and the members of the Privy Council, the aldermen of London and the senior members of the judiciary, and all the bishops of the English Church followed. Then the entire nobility, both peers and peeresses in their robes, processed in order according to their rank and degree, followed by the archbishops, who went ahead of any princes of the blood royal. Throughout the procession were spread out the heralds and the kings of arms in their heraldic surcoats, and the sergeants of arms carrying the royal maces. Then came the regalia peers and the great officers of state. 3 peers carrying the sceptre with the cross, the spurs and St Edward's staff. Then 3 more carrying the 3 swords, the blunt sword of mercy known as katana, the sword of spiritual justice and the sword of temporal justice. Then the gentleman usher of the black rod, Garter, principal king of arms, and the Lord Mayor of London were followed by the Lord Great Chamberlain, the Lord High Constable, and the Earl Marshal, who flanked the peer who had been appointed to carry the sword of state. Then followed 2 bishops carrying the chalice and the paten for Holy Communion, and from the 17th century onwards a 3rd bishop carrying a copy of the Scriptures. The Lord Great Treasurer and the Lord High Chancellor, 2 of the great officers of state, are not included in this procession in the early modern period. In the Middle Ages, these 2 offices were invariably held by bishops, and those bishops were those appointed to carry the chalice and the paten. From the mid-16th century onwards, the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Treasurer were now invariably laymen, and from 1714 the Lord Treasurership was now held in commission among different individuals, so other bishops were then substituted to carry the chalice and paten instead. Now, a timber walkway was constructed that snaked from the south door of Westminster Hall across what is now Parliament Square and Broad Sanctuary to the west door of Westminster Abbey. This walkway was flanked along its length by guardsmen. The walkway was generally covered with a large quantity of striped, later blue cloth that was provided by the Lord High Almoner and was later distributed to the poor. This engraving shows George IV processing from his coronation back to Westminster Hall, and you can see that there are stands around the walkway like those at the races, so that onlookers could see the impressive sight of the king and his great entourage both going to and returning from the coronation. Tickets were sold for these, with seats in what was called the Grand Pavilion having the best views of all the flummery, being very pricey indeed. The King and Queen did not walk to their coronation uncovered and unattended in this procession. This engraving from Sanford's account of the coronation of James II in 1685 shows the King making his way to the Abbey. He is preceded immediately by the three dukes who carry the regalia, St Edward's crown, the sceptre with the dove and the orb. The king is supported on either side by the bishops of Durham and Bath and Wells, who have had this role for time immemorial. The train of the king's state robe is supported by the eldest sons of 4 earls, with the master of the robes taking up the rear. The king proceeds under a massive canopy that is borne by 16 barons of the Cinque Ports, 3 holding each corner pole and 2 holding the intermediate poles. I will do another video on who the barons of the Cinque Ports are, as it is rather too complicated to go into here. They are essentially the freemen of certain ports in Kent and Sussex. The king is then guarded on all sides once again by members of the Honourable Band of Gentlemen Pensioners. Behind the king walk the 3 captains of the guard. Those are the gentlemen pensioners, the foot guard in waiting and the yeomen of the guard. I mustn't forget one of the other unusual roles in the coronation procession from the late 17th century until the coronation of George IV. Directly in front of the regalia peers walked the king's herb woman and her assistants. The role of the king's herb woman, who was usually a daughter of a gentry family, was to scatter sweet herbs on the floor of the royal palaces, an important job in smelly early modern London. In the coronation procession, the herb woman and her assistants scattered sweet herbs in front of the path that the king trod. This wonderful engraving shows Miss Fellows, George IV's herb woman, performing her duties in 1821. She was the last person to hold that office. From the coronation of James II onwards, the Queen Consort has always walked ahead of her husband in the procession, but prior to that she followed her husband. It is quite unthinkable that they walk together, as each has their own quite separate household to support them, and of course their own regalia. Now there was one exception to that rule, and that was the coronation of William and Mary in 1689, who as joint sovereigns walked side by side to their coronation. This engraving, also from Sandford's account of the coronation of James II, is of Mary of Modena, James's consort, walking to her coronation. She has two bishops to support her, who were chosen by the Archbishop of Canterbury for the role, and has a canopy, again supported by 16 barons of the Cinque Ports. She is guarded too by the gentlemen pensioners. Her train is carried by 4 earls' daughters, with the mistress of the robes taking the rear, and behind her ladies of the Queen's bedchamber. The only sovereign not to walk to their coronation in the early modern period was Queen Anne, who due to gout and infirmity was unable to do so, so she was carried in a chair under the canopy. As time went on, the procession only got bigger. The nobility was vastly increased in size in the 18th century, and more roles were created within the royal household, and the sovereign and the consort had many more personal household servants, and these were added to the procession too. After the Act of Union with Scotland at the beginning of the 18th century, and then that with Ireland at the beginning of the 19th century, some of the great officers of state of those kingdoms and their representative peers also joined the procession. When the walking procession from Westminster Hall to the Abbey was abolished in 1831, and from there on in the sovereign has arrived at the west door of the Abbey in the gold state coach, the procession was only really curtailed with the removal of the peers, peeresses and bishops from it, who were then directed to be seated before the service started. The procession up the aisle of the Abbey that from 1831 replaced this longer walking procession was still large. In the 20th century, although the nobility were no longer part of it, additional people were added to the procession that reflected the changing political establishment and the international standing of Britain. Standard bearers of the British Empire dominions were included, and later those of the British Commonwealth, and the Prime Ministers of the various British dominions had a part to play too, as well as the officers and representatives of the chivalric orders that proliferated in Britain in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Among the clergy, representatives of other denominations were now included, and also of the Church of Scotland. Prior to 1831, those involved in the procession had the great space of Westminster Hall to form up in, but with no space at the Abbey to use for this purpose, it caused a bit of a headache. The solution was to construct a temporary timber vestibule at the west end of the nave of the Abbey, where all the people involved in this great procession could gather. This has been the norm at every coronation since 1831, though I suspect we will not see quite so grand a structure erected this time as we did in 1937 and 1953. The old tradition of the Dean and Chapter bringing the coronation regalia to the sovereign continued right up until the last coronation in 1953, though in a revised form. The regalia is now brought from the Jewel House in the Tower of London to the Abbey the night before the coronation, and is then placed in the deanery in a room called the Jerusalem Chamber. It is then brought by the Dean and Canons from the deanery early in the morning and is placed by them on the high altar, where it rests for a time before being taken by them to the vestibule, ready for the peers appointed to carry them in the procession. From the early 17th century onwards, it has been the established tradition that once the sovereign reaches the west door and they enter the Abbey, the choir begin to sing Psalm 122. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord, which speaks of the prosperity and peace of Jerusalem and the house of David as the source of justice. One of the traditions that has emerged spontaneously it seems, at the coronation of James II, is that as the Queen and the King enter the choir of the Abbey, they are saluted by the scholars of Westminster School, who are watching the coronation from a gallery next to the great choir screen. They interrupt the singing with the repeated cry of "Vivat Regina, long live the Queen," and "Vivat Rex, long live the King." Hopefully, this lovely tradition will be kept, and we will hear the cries of "Vivat Regina Camilla" and "Vivat Rex Carolus," long live Queen Camilla and long live King Charles, as the King and Queen enter the coronation theatre in procession for their coronation and hallowing in 5 weeks' time. Thanks very much for watching.